Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. October 1923. The kind of cold that arrives before the calendar says it should, settling into the bones of the town like it had always lived there. Lenora Fitch had taken the morning train. She sat near the window with her coat buttoned to the collar and a hatbox on the seat beside her, because she hadn't known what else to bring. The letter was in her left coat pocket. She'd stopped reading it 3 days ago. She had it memorized by then anyway. She was 34 years old. She had worked 6 years as a bookkeeper for a grain merchant in Winnipeg. She had learned to be steady in a world that wasn't, and when the letter arrived from a man named Stuart Aldred, widower, 42, farming quarter section north of Moose Jaw, seeking a practical woman of good character, she had written back honestly the way she did everything. They had exchanged 4 letters over 2 months. His words were plain and without flattery, which she appreciated. He'd said, "I'm not looking for someone to fill her place. I'm looking for someone willing to build something new." She had believed him. The station at Moose Jaw was low and brown and smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. Lenora stepped down onto the platform with the hatbox in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. And she stood there while the steam cleared and the other passengers moved around her like water around a stone. She saw him right away. Stuart Aldred was a tall man, standing apart from the small crowd, his hat in his hands. He looked like the land had made him, broad through the shoulders, weathered at the edges, eyes that had spent years measuring distances. He saw her the moment she saw him. He walked over without hurrying. "Miss Fitch?" "That's right." He looked at her the way a man looks at a ledger he's not sure adds up. Not unkind. Just calculating. His eyes moved to the hatbox, then back to her face, then briefly, just briefly, to the shape of her, the plainness of her coat, the practical cut of her hair. "You're younger than I pictured," he said. And then, "That's not. I don't mean that as a complaint. It's just." He stopped. He looked away at something past the station roof. "My daughter," he said finally. "She's 17. She's had a difficult time since her mother passed. I wrote to you about that." "You did." She wasn't. "She hasn't taken well to the idea of this, of me writing to anyone. I thought she'd come around, but this morning she said she won't have a stranger in the house. She said it plainly enough." He turned his hat around once in his hands. "I'm sorry. I should have told you before you made the trip. That wasn't right of me." Lenora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "No, it wasn't." He nodded once, jaw tight. He had the grace to look ashamed, at least. He didn't offer to carry anything. He didn't offer a ride back to the station hotel. He just said he was sorry again, and put his hat back on, and walked to the road where a truck was parked, and Lenora watched the truck pull away into the gray October afternoon. She stood on the platform until the truck was gone. A woman sweeping the station steps glanced over. Didn't say anything, kept sweeping. Lenora picked up her satchel. The hatbox handle bit into her fingers. She walked through the station and out the other side onto Main Street, and she walked like a woman who had a destination in mind, even though she didn't. She had been disappointed before, by smaller things and larger ones, by a father who preferred silence, by a man in Winnipeg who had courted her for a year and then married someone else without so much as a word of explanation, by a war that had taken her brother in 1917 and sent nothing back. This felt different because she had let herself expect something. That was the mistake, she thought. You don't let yourself expect things. You stay level, you stay useful. You keep the book straight and you don't read the letters more than twice. The main street of Moose Jaw ran long and flat under a sky the color of pewter. She passed a hardware store, a bakery with the lights already on against the afternoon gray, a barber shop with its pole still turning. A dog watched her from a doorway. She didn't stop. At the corner near the post office, she paused to shift the hat box to her other hand. That's a long way to carry a box. She turned. The man standing near the corner was perhaps 45, maybe older. It was hard to say. He was lean and dark-haired, going gray at the temples. and he had the look of someone who worked with his hands not because he had no other options but because he'd chosen it. His coat was good wool but worn at the elbows. He held a paper bag of something, groceries from the look of it, and he was watching her with the directness of a man who didn't feel the need to soften things, but wasn't unkind about it, either. "I've carried worse," Lenora said. "I don't doubt it." He didn't move. "You just come in on the morning train? Is it that obvious? You don't have the look of someone who knows where she's going." She considered that. "No," she said. "I don't." He was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The kind that waits for you to say what you want to say. "I had an arrangement," she said, because the cold was making her honest. "It didn't work out. The hotel, do you know which direction?" 2 blocks east." He paused. "The Maple Rest is cheaper than the Colonial and the beds are cleaner. I'd take the Maple Rest. Thank you." She started walking. She'd gone perhaps 10 paces when he said, not loudly, "There's a diner on Fairford Street. Decent soup, if you're cold." She didn't stop, but she said, "What's it called?" "Bridget's. You can't miss it. Red door." She found it 20 minutes later after she'd left her things at the Maple Rest, which was exactly as he'd described. Quiet and clean, run by a woman named Mrs. Hogarth who asked no questions and gave her a room on the 2nd floor overlooking the alley. Lenora washed her hands and face and went back out. Bridget's had a red door and 4 tables and a counter with 5 stools. It smelled of beef broth and bread and something sweet baking in back. She took the stool at the far end and ordered soup and tea. And she sat with her hands around the mug and let herself be warm for a few minutes without thinking about anything at all. He came in about 20 minutes later. He looked surprised to actually see her there, which she appreciated. It meant he hadn't been following, had just told her the truth about the soup. He took a stool too down from hers and ordered coffee and pie. He was quiet for a bit. Then, "Better? The soup is good," she said. "Bridget's mother made it the same way. I've been coming here 15 years. You're from here?" "Moved here in 1910. Had a place east of town for a while. Sold it. I do carpenter work now, mostly. Houses, barns, the odd church." She looked at him sideways. "You don't seem like a man who gives out his history to strangers." "I don't usually." He looked down at his coffee. "You looked like you'd had a difficult afternoon." "I have good days and difficult ones. Today is one of the difficult ones. The arrangement that didn't work out. He changed his mind at the platform, or his daughter changed it for him." The man beside her was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A daughter, 17. She didn't want a stranger in the house, which is a fair enough feeling to have, I suppose. I just wish he'd written ahead. That's a long way to come to be told no at a train station." "Winnipeg." She looked at her soup. "Yes, it is." He was quiet again. It wasn't a judging quiet, or a pitying one. It was simply the quiet of a man who understood that sometimes things happen and there's nothing useful to say about them. His name, when he finally offered it, because she hadn't asked, and he seemed to notice that, was Reuben Calloway. He said it straight, the way you say a thing you have no reason to be ashamed of. "Lenora Fitch," she said. He nodded. They finished their respective soup and pie without needing to fill the space with noise, which Lenora found to be one of the rarer things in the world. He walked her back to the Maple Rest, not close, just in the same direction, on the same side of the street. When they reached the door, he said he'd be in town tomorrow if she needed someone to point her toward the eastbound train schedule, and she said she'd manage, and he said he didn't doubt it, and that was that. She lay in the clean, narrow bed at the Maple Rest that night and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was going to do now. She was practical, above all things. She would go back to Winnipeg on Thursday. She would write a letter to Stuart Aldred's daughter, not to Stuart, and tell her that she understood, and that she hoped the girl found some peace. That was the right thing. That was what you did. She slept. In the morning, the cold had arrived with intention. Ice on the inside of the window glass, the radiator in her room clicking and wheezing but holding. She dressed and went down to the small breakfast room and ate porridge and read the newspaper Mrs. Hogarth left on each table and she was just folding it when she heard the noise in the street. A raised voice. A woman's voice, high and frightened. Lenora set down the paper and went to the front window. In the street outside, not 10 feet from the hotel entrance, a young woman was being held by the arm by a man in a good overcoat, the kind that signals money spent but not necessarily earned. He wasn't hitting her. He was just holding her arm at an angle that made her lean away from herself, and he was speaking, very close to her face, with the casual confidence of a man who believed no one was going to intervene. The young woman was perhaps 20. She had a basket of something. Eggs, it looked like. And she'd gone very still in the way that frightened people do when they calculate that stillness is safest. 2 people passed on the opposite sidewalk and kept walking. Lenora put on her coat and hat on the way down the stairs. She pushed out the front door into the bitter morning. The man didn't see her coming because he was looking at the young woman, who he was in the middle of, informing that the rent had been due on Monday and he didn't care what her mother's situation was. He'd given them a week already. "Excuse me," Lenora said. The man turned. He had a florid face and small eyes, and the look of a man unaccustomed to being interrupted. "I'm occupied, I can see that. And so can Mrs. Hogarth," Lenora said, nodding toward the hotel window where Mrs. Hogarth had in fact appeared, watching with considerable interest. "And so can Constable Reed," she added, because she had no idea if there was a Constable Reed in Moose Jaw, but she had found that specificity was more persuasive than generality. The man looked at Mrs. Hogarth's face in the window. He let go of the young woman's arm. He straightened his coat. He said, "This isn't your business." "You made it everyone's business when you came onto a public street," Lenora said. "Thank you for letting go." He looked at her with the compressed fury of a man who has decided the situation doesn't favor him. He left. He went south on Main Street without looking back, which Lenora found to be the best outcome she could have hoped for. The young woman was holding her basket with both hands and breathing carefully. "Are you all right?" Lenora asked. "Yes." "Then no. But I will be. Is there somewhere you're going?" "Mrs. Clancy's. 2 streets over. I bring eggs on Wednesdays. I'll walk with you if that's all right." Her name was Bet Prentice. She was 21, not as young as Lenora had thought. She lived with her mother and a younger sister in a rented house near the rail yards. And the man, his name was Dunning. He owned 4 rental houses in the neighborhood, had been at them for 2 months over a shortfall that had started when Bet's mother got sick in August and couldn't work. "Can you pay it?" Lenora asked, not to pry, to understand the shape of the problem. "Eventually, probably. My mother's better now. She went back to the laundry last week. But Dunning doesn't want eventually. He wants now, or he wants us out so he can rent to someone else." They reached Mrs. Clancy's. Bet knocked and waited. She looked at Lenora. "You're not from here." "No, just passing through." "You do that often? Just step in like that?" Lenora thought about it. "When it seems like it needs doing," she said. Bet almost smiled. "Thank you." Lenora walked back toward the hotel. The cold had settled in around her ears and the tip of her nose, and she was thinking about breakfast and whether she could get another cup of tea. When she turned the corner onto Fairford and nearly walked into Reuben Calloway, who was carrying a length of timber on his shoulder with the ease of a man for whom this was routine, he stopped, set the timber down against the wall, looked at her. "You have a scrape on your chin," he said. She put her fingers to her jaw and found that yes, she did. She must have caught it on her coat collar coming down the hotel stairs at speed. She hadn't noticed. "There was a situation," she said. "I heard." He tilted his head slightly. "Mrs. Hogarth talks. It was nothing serious. Dunning doesn't back down for nothing serious. He backed down for you." She looked at him. "I mentioned Constable Reed." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "There is no Constable Reed. I know that now." He picked up the timber again. "You eaten?" "Porridge before the interruption. There's a better place for breakfast. If you're not in a hurry." "I'm not in any kind of hurry," she said, which was true and also the saddest sentence she'd said in some time. He seemed to understand that. He didn't say anything about it. He just said, "Up here then," and started walking, and she walked beside him through the cold October morning as if they'd been walking beside each other for considerably longer than a day. The better place for breakfast was a kitchen, as it turned out. His kitchen, in a house 3 streets off Main, small and square and well built in the way that houses built by carpenters tend to be, level, everything fitting right. It smelled of wood shavings and coffee and the faint animal warmth of a house that had a dog somewhere. The dog appeared from the back room, a large brown dog of no identifiable breed, with a gray muzzle and the calm authority of an elderly statesman. "That's Douglas," Reuben said, hanging the timber on the back porch and coming in to wash his hands. "He's 11. He doesn't bother anyone." Douglas sniffed Lenora's hand, and then went back to his spot near the stove with the air of a who had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Reuben made eggs and toast without ceremony and poured coffee without asking, which was the right thing to do. They sat at the kitchen table. Outside, a crow landed on the back fence and regarded them with the usual crow opinion of human activity. "You have a family?" she asked. "Had a wife, Eleanor. She passed 4 years ago. Influenza, I'm sorry. So was I." He said it simply, which made it true. "No children. We wanted them. It didn't work out that way. Where's your family from?" "Nova Scotia, originally. I moved west in my 20s. Got restless." He looked at his coffee. "Eleanor was from here. After she passed, I thought about going back east. But there's nothing to go back to, really. The work is here. Douglas is here." He glanced at the dog. "He's not good in trains." She laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to laugh. He looked up from his coffee with something cautious and warm in his face, the expression of a man who hadn't expected that either, and was quietly glad. "You're a bookkeeper," he said. 6 years. For a grain merchant. He retired in the spring and sold the business, so I've been looking for something since June. I thought this arrangement might work out, that maybe there'd be something useful I could do there." "On the farm. You know farming?" "No, but I learned things quickly." She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. It was stupid, probably, to come all this way on 4 letters. "No," he said, and he said it with enough certainty that she looked up. "You answered honestly. That's not stupid. That's just what happens when you deal with someone who isn't honest back." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're very direct. I find it saves time." "It does," she agreed. "I appreciate it." They finished breakfast. She helped clear the plates, not because it was expected, but because it felt natural. Douglas moved from his spot by the stove to sit near the door, which Reuben said meant the dog thought it was time for a walk. "I'll take him," Reuben said. "You're welcome to come if you want the cold." She wanted the cold, as it happened. They walked Douglas through a neighborhood of small houses and large yards, and garden plots gone dormant for the season. The dog walked with the measured dignity of an old animal who had learned that hurrying doesn't improve the outcome of a walk. They walked in the kind of quiet that had no expectation attached to it. At the end of a street that backed onto open field, they stopped and the dog lifted his nose to the wind. "What will you do?" Reuben asked. Not presumptuously, just plainly. "Go back to Winnipeg on Thursday. Look for another position. You could look here." She turned to him. "Not for any reason except practicality," he said, and he held her gaze in a way that was honest and clear. "The town is growing. There are 3 businesses on Main Street looking for someone to handle their accounts. I happen to know because I built one of their back offices last spring, and the owner said so." He paused. "It would be your business, not mine. I'm just telling you the situation." She studied his face. She had learned over 34 years to read the difference between a man offering help and a man trying to put you somewhere he wanted you. This was the first kind. "Why?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "You stepped into a bad situation this morning because it needed doing, not because anyone would notice. You took a long train ride in good faith and got badly treated, and you haven't complained about it once. You've just dealt with it." He looked at the dog, And you make Douglas comfortable, which is not an easy thing. He doesn't like most people. I like dogs, she said. I know, it shows. They stood in the thin October light for a moment. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. She thought about it for the rest of that day, walking the town alone in the afternoon while Reuben went back to his work. A window frame that needed replacing in a house on the north end. She walked to the post office, and then to the library, and then to the 3 businesses he'd mentioned, which she found without asking anyone because she had a good sense of a town's geography after an afternoon in it. She stood outside each one and looked in through the windows and thought about the books. She could see from where she stood, and whether they looked like someone was keeping them well. One of them, a dry goods store called Petrie & Son, had a ledger sitting open on the counter, and even from the street she could see the columns were off. She went in. She talked to the man behind the counter, whose name was William Petrie, who was perhaps 60 and wore the expression of a man who understood materials and measurements but not numbers. And she asked to look at the ledger with the directness that Reuben had made her think was worth applying more liberally. He let her look at it. She found 3 errors in the October entries in the first 2 minutes. You've been undercharging yourself on the hardware orders, she said, and you've got the feed invoices in the wrong column. It's not large amounts, but over a year it would be significant. William Petrie looked at her over his glasses. You're a bookkeeper. I am. You here permanently? She hesitated only a moment. I'm considering it. I'd pay you fairly, he said. I've been doing these myself since my daughter moved to Regina, and I clearly should not be. She came back to Reuben's house that evening because she didn't know where else to tell the story. She sat at his kitchen table and told him about Petrie & Son and the 3 errors and William Petrie's expression. And Douglas put his large gray head in her lap while she talked, and she kept her hand on his ear without really thinking about it. Reuben listened the way he did everything, without interrupting, without performing interest, just actually paying attention. He offered you the work? He did. You going to take it? I think I might. She looked down at Douglas. I'll need lodging. Mrs. Hogarth's rates are fair. They are. She paused. I'll have to write to Winnipeg. Let my landlady know. The library has a typewriter you can use. Thursday mornings. I know. I went in this afternoon. He looked at her then with the expression she was beginning to recognize. The one that wasn't quite amusement, but held something close to it. You sorted most of this already. I sort things, she said. It's what I do, I know. It shows. She looked at him across the table. There were 100 practical reasons to go back to Winnipeg, and she could list them in order of importance, and there was one reason to stay that had nothing to do with William Petrie's ledger, or Mrs. Hogarth's clean sheets, or the dry goods store with its promising disorder. She wasn't going to name it yet. It was too new and she was too careful for that. But she sat in Reuben Calloway's kitchen, with his dog's head in her lap, and the wood stove going steady in the corner, and she thought, well, this doesn't feel like nothing. She went back to the Maple Rest, and she didn't sleep badly. 3 days later, she was at her new desk at the back of Petrie & Son, with William Petrie's October ledger in front of her, when the door opened and a woman came in who was not there for dry goods. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a slightly overstated way, and she stood in the center of the store and announced to William Petrie, in a carrying voice that she had heard. There was a new bookkeeper in town, a woman from Winnipeg, who had come here to insert herself into an arrangement with Stuart Aldred and had been properly turned away. William looked at Lenora. Lenora set down her pen. That would be me, she said, and came to stand at the counter. The woman, whose name Lenora did not know and whom she declined to ask, seemed to have expected more to resist. You should know, the woman said, that people in this town look after their own. Stuart Aldred is a respected man. His daughter has had a difficult enough time without a stranger upsetting things further. I agree with all of that, Lenora said. I haven't spoken to Stuart Aldred or his daughter since I stepped off the train. I have no intention of doing so. I'm here, Because I was offered work, and I took it. Work. The woman looked at the ledger on the desk, and then back at Lenora, with an expression that suggested she found the idea improbable. Bookkeeping, Lenora said. Which is what I do. Well. The woman smoothed the front of her coat. I'm simply saying that people will wonder. They're welcome to wonder, Lenora said pleasantly. Is there something I can help you with today? There wasn't. The woman left. William Petrie waited until the door closed and then exhaled slowly. That's Edna Burnett, he said. She's Stuart Aldred's wife's cousin. Second cousin, I think. She's been here since 1898 and she hasn't liked any newcomers since. She likes you, Lenora said. I've been here 22 years. I'll be here 23, Lenora said, and went back to the ledger. She told Reuben about it that evening. They had settled into a loose and unannounced routine. She would stop by in the late afternoon. Sometimes they would walk Douglas. Sometimes she would sit at his kitchen table and they would read. He had a lot of books for a carpenter. She had mentioned this. And he had said his father had been a school teacher in Cape Breton, and some things stayed in you, no matter how far west you went. He listened to the account of Edna Burnett with the attentiveness he gave everything. You know what she'll say next, he said. That I'm after him. Stuart Aldred, or worse. Let her. Lenora looked out the kitchen window at the back fence where the crow had returned, apparently irregular. I've been talked about before. It passes. It does. He paused. She might also talk about you spending evenings here. She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm telling you the situation, same as you told me about the ledger. I know you're not asking me to stop, she said. Good. Are you worried about it? He thought about it. No, he said. I find I'm not. Neither am I, she said. Douglas shifted by the stove and made the small groan of a dog settling in for the night. Reuben got up to put more wood in the stove. Lenora went back to her book. The crow on the fence ruffled its feathers once and went still. Edna Burnett spoke to 3 more people over the course of the following week. And 2 of those people came into Petrie and Son on the pretense of purchasing things they could have bought at the hardware store. Lenora served them politely and found their items and thanked them for their custom. William Petrie, who had been watching from behind a display of seed catalogs, found this adequate enough to mention to his wife, who apparently had some influence of her own, and somewhere in the architecture of the town the opinion of Lenora Fitch shifted without any particular announcement being made about it. Bet Prentice came in one afternoon for lamp oil and stayed half an hour talking, which Lenora found she didn't mind. Bet had a sharp mind and a sense of humor that came out sideways, the best kind. Dunning hasn't come back, Bet said. Good. My mother says you're the woman who told him there was a constable watching. I improvised. She wants to thank you. Tell her it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, Bet said, in the way of a person who has finished arguing the point and has simply stated the last word. The town of Moose Jaw, like most towns, had a longer memory for scandal than for decency. But Lenora Fitch had the advantage of being thoroughly, stubbornly decent in full view of everyone, which is a harder thing to sustain a scandal around. By the middle of November, she was simply the woman at Petrie and Son who kept the books, who walked that old brown dog some mornings, who had stepped in about the Prentice girl and the business with Dunning. The story about Stuart Aldred faded, as stories do when they don't get fed. It was the last week of November when the second thing happened. Lenora was closing up at Petrie and Son on a Friday evening, locking the back office, when she heard the front door of the store open, and the particular voice of a young woman who was trying to sound more composed than she was. Is she here? The voice said. The bookkeeper. William Petrie's voice cautious. She's just in the back. Should I? Please. Lenora came to the counter. The girl was 17. She knew that right away, or near enough to it. Fair-haired, red-eyed, wearing her coat half-buttoned in the way of someone who had left in a hurry without thinking about the weather. She looked at Lenora with the complex expression of someone who has rehearsed something and now isn't sure of it. My name is Ruth Aldred, she said. Lenora waited. I'm the reason. Ruth stopped. She looked at the counter. I know why you're here, and I know you haven't another stop. My father told me you wrote a letter. To me. I didn't get it till last week. It was still in his coat. She looked up. He didn't give it to me. Ah, Lenora said. He thought it would make things worse. But then I found it. Ruth's hands were at her sides, tight. You said you understood. In the letter that I was right to feel how I felt, and that you weren't there to replace anyone. That's what I said. Did you mean it? I mean what I write, Lenora said. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. The evening outside had gone properly dark. William Petrie had retreated with considerable tact to the back of the store, where there was probably nothing that needed doing. I shouldn't have. Ruth's voice cracked slightly and she stopped it. He's been alone for 2 years, and he's not. He doesn't know what to do with himself. I can see it. But I thought if he moved on it meant he was forgetting, and I couldn't. She stopped herself properly this time. I'm not asking you to come back. That's not what this is. He doesn't know I'm here. I just needed to tell you that I was wrong about what I thought you were. What did you think I was? Someone taking advantage. Someone who wanted a farm and a name and didn't care about my father or anything else. She looked at Lenora straight. You're not that. No, Lenora agreed. I'm sorry, Ruth said. It was the straight, simple kind of sorry that costs something to say. Thank you for coming, Lenora said. That took courage. Ruth buttoned her coat properly, finally, and left. The bell over the door rang once, and then the street was quiet. William Petrie came out from the back with the expression of a man who has tried very hard not to hear anything. Nothing in those seed catalogs this time of year, he remarked. No, Lenora agreed. She walked to Reuben's house in the dark, and he opened the door before she knocked because Douglas had heard her coming. She told him about Ruth Aldred. She told him plainly, all of it, watching his face. He listened. Then he said, She's a good kid, she is. She didn't have to come, no. He was quiet for a moment. Does it change anything? For you? She looked at him across the kitchen. The stove was going. Douglas was in his spot. The crow, presumably, was wherever crows went at night. No, she said. I'm where I want to be. He nodded once. Then he poured 2 cups of tea without asking, which was still the right thing to do, and sat down across from her. And they were quiet together in the way they had gotten good at, which was the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. December came, and the cold with it, the serious kind that makes the prairies feel endless, in a way that is almost beautiful if you can keep your feet warm. Lenora bought good wool socks at Petrie & Son and charged them to her own account, which made William laugh and say it was the only time he'd been glad someone pilfered from the store. She and Reuben walked Douglas through the short December afternoons, through streets that smelled of wood smoke and frozen earth. Once, near the river, he took her hand because the ice on the path was uncertain, and then he didn't let go when the path evened out, and she didn't take her hand back. They didn't discuss it. Some things are simply decided. On the first Sunday of December, they went to the small Anglican church on Ominica Street, not because either of them was particularly religious, but because Mrs. Hogarth had mentioned the choir needed a soprano, and Lenora had one more quality she'd been keeping to herself. She sang. He sat beside her in the pew and listened with the expression he got when something surprised him well. Afterward, on the steps in the cold, he said, You might have mentioned that. You didn't ask. I'm asking now. Is there anything else? She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. I play cribbage reasonably well. I make a good potato soup. I once argued a customs inspector into returning a shipment he had no right to hold, using only the relevant section of the Import Act. That last one especially, he said. I'd have liked to see that. There's time, she said, and there was. They were married in February, on a Saturday, in the same small church on Ominica Street, because the choir was already there and it seemed efficient. The minister was a younger man who appreciated brevity. Reuben wore his good jacket. Lenora wore a dress of deep green wool that she'd ordered from Eaton's catalog because she believed, if you were going to mark a thing, you should mark it properly. William Petrie and his wife sat in the second pew. Bet Prentice and her mother sat behind them. Mrs. Hogarth came in from the cold, still wearing her apron under her coat, and seemed unbothered by this. A few other people Lenora had come to know in the way you come to know people, when you do their accounts honestly, and don't make a fuss about it. Ruth Aldred was not there, but 2 days before, she had left a small package at Petrie & Son, a jar of honey from their bees, and a note that said simply, "I hope you're happy. I think you will be." Lenora had written back to say she thought so too. Douglas lay in the church doorway with the patience of a dog, who had been to a number of human events and understood that they required waiting. When they came out after, he stood and wagged once and walked between them down the steps. The February sky over Moose Jaw was pale and wide, and the cold was clean rather than mean. Lenora Fitch, now Lenora Calloway, though she kept Fitch on the store ledgers because it was already printed on the front page, and changing it seemed wasteful, walked down Ominica Street with her hand in Rubens and Douglas pacing steady beside them. She had come to Moose Jaw on a train with a hatbox, and 4 letters and an honest answer to a plain question. The answer had brought her somewhere she hadn't planned on, and the place she hadn't planned on turned out to be the one that fit. There is no right age for that kind of finding. There is only the willingness to keep carrying what you've got until someone sees you standing and doesn't look away.